yet another episode of Smash the Bug podcast. I'm your host, Joseph, and
I'm Jesse.
We are here to talk about problems, troubles, and more problems. That was a really bad way to start this podcast because no, we're not going to only talk about problems, troubles, and more problems. We're going to talk about some news first, and then we're going to go into the stories that the challenges that we faced and how we overcome those challenges. So in that way, it's problems, troubles, and more problems. But ultimately, there's I'm not going to say a silver lining. We're able to achieve solutions. And our goal in sharing these challenges that we face and ultimately the solutions we've come to is to encourage you that as you are fighting through these problems and it seems like, I don't know, people are jumping on your desk of the merchant you're working for is like, hey, why can't we get this problem solved sooner? There is light at the end of the tunnel, and if you stick with it, you will achieve the solution yourself. Now, obviously, what we're going to be talking through is also the debugging techniques and some of the things that we are learning from ourselves to hopefully give you more tools in the toolbox so you can solve problems faster. So see how that all kind of works together. So without further ado, let's talk about some news. Jesse,
Yeah.
do you have any news to talk about?
Yeah, well, the Shopware announced that they have quite a little funding.
Well,
that they
I'm sorry, you said Shopware.
Shopware.
We're Magento.
Shopware. Yes, I know, but Shopware.
That's like being a trader. That's being a trader, man.
No, it's not. We are not. We're not aligned only with one brand in particular.
That's fair.
Competition is a good thing because if Shopware develops a whole bunch of features, then Magento or Adobe might just look at Shopware and say, oh, that's some cool stuff over there. Maybe we want to add these features into our own platform. As a matter of fact, I was talking with one of my coworkers just today, and we were talking about some features that it would be nice for Magento to add.
Like what?
So, well, the ability to edit order information. Right now in Magento, if you want to edit order information, you have to replace that whole order. But what would it be like for Magento to add some limited editing capabilities?
You can edit the shipping and billing address. You know that.
Well, that's great. So there's a little bit right there.
With a caveat. Doing that none of the totals change. So if you're shipping from one side of the US to switching it to the other side, shipping rates will change and you have a problem.
Yeah, so that's a limitation, right? Mm-hmm. But if you could take that a step further and edit the things relating to the prices. Now, I am very, very aware that opens up a huge can of worms and all of that. But for larger clients, that's a more important piece of the puzzle because things change after an order is placed.
All the time.
So yes, you can replace that order, but what options are there for editing that order? Mm-hmm. So, things like that, there's more functionality that they could add that I would love to see them develop over time. And $100 million in Shopware funding, maybe that'll get some more features going and some competition going.
Absolutely.
There. And I'm all for that.
Yeah, and so I think we'll leave it at that. There is a feature coming out on Magento's side that I think is slightly less than relevant. I think it's still under NDA, so we can't say anything about that. But we'll talk about that later. So as such, the other thing is, we always like to call out the certification challenge that is in progress, underway, and this has been a bang up year for that. Like it's been tremendous. So previous years, we say we've done some. This is the third year in a row. First year, we did every other week. We had a conversation, motivation, challenge, encouragement. Here's how you achieve your certification. Second year, people's like, hey, let's talk a little bit more technical. Well, the problem is that the business practitioners left out of the technical conversations. That's frustrating. I get that. So we did technical conversations on the off weeks. But then this year, we have done full-blown study groups, and those are dynamite. So basically, I lead one for business practitioner, although I'll be out for a couple of weeks, so I have somebody that is graciously filling in. Jesse's leading one on what are you?
Front end. I'm doing front end developer.
Yep, front end, and we have one for professional and one for expert developer. So like these are the way that it's really good engagement, and the reason it's really good engagement, number one, we're not recording it. So if you're wanting to watch this after the fact, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. I know that sounds harsh to say, but real quick, the reason is the dynamics of the group literally happen because there is a live group there. And watching it after the fact encourages people to not show up for the live conversation, which greatly diminishes the value for everybody. So the more people we get in there, the more questions asked, the more dynamic it is. And it's going really, really good.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. Part of what's easy to do with online learning is to procrastinate, right? Because there's no deadline, there's no timestamp. If you attend a university or college somewhere, you show up to class on time, or at least you better if you want to get good grades.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And the thing is, with the internet, it's the same thing, except that there's no deadlines in the same sort of way, right? Meaning, even with the internet, in order to achieve a certification, or pass a class, right? If in using this analogy, you still have to show up on time and do the work. So, procrastinating and putting things off doesn't help in passing that certification. And there's this hidden little thing about these these study groups that I think is really let's just say it's a hidden gem. And the bottom line is you get access to some of the best developers out there, or basically subject matter experts on these topics to ask whatever difficult question you want. And while they may not answer the question just outright for you, they will likely help you find the answer, which is even better.
Absolutely.
That's the whole point of it, because if you know how to find the answer, then you'll find it next time yourself without needing to go for them. So it's one of those just little things that's part of those study groups.
Give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. That's how we operate, and that's how we work. That's how we work hard. Another thing, real quick, just this friendly reminder: 244 Magento Adobe Commerce 244 is coming out on March 8th, which is exactly 1 month from today as we are recording this, and I'm very excited about this. However, I do have to temper my excitement by the fact that I realize that not all modules will be up to PHP specifications on the day of release. So as you hear this, as you're listening to this conversation, make sure to bug those module vendors. I know they're busy. I know they got lots on their plates, but I'm really excited to get to PHP 8 myself. And the sooner we can get updates across the ecosystem in place, the sooner we're all going to be able to get up to PHP 8, because it's going to be those large merchants that it's going to take a long time to get them up to PHP 8 because they're using more modules or whatever. So
just remember, PHP 8 is great.
Nice.
There you go.
Which is released on March 8th.
Oh man, that's hard to beat. That's fantastic. And you're going to get better code anyways, right? If when you upgrade and make it compatible, that's a better product.
When you said
it's a win-win-win.
When you said that's hard to beat, that's a pun, right? PHP 8 is going to be great. Which will be released on March 8th. I'm not a rapper, but and
you cannot be beat. Yeah,
well, that's the beats we're laying down.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, someone should put together a poem on that. Rhyme, rhythm. All
right, so let's talk about, again, like I said, we're going to talk about some of these challenges that we're dealing with on a daily basis. I wish Magento didn't do this, but I think it's kind of like every platform. We're going to have issues and trying to solve things and dealing with complex customer requirements and just there's challenges, right, in this field. We got to keep the lights on. And those of you that are e-commerce developers, as you are listening to this conversation, I want to reiterate, as I like to do often, you are a hero. You are the people who are keeping the lights on for these merchants, which is putting food on the table for these merchants, which is feeding a lot of mouths. And it's easy to lose sight of, especially if we're down in the rabbit hole fighting a problem. It's easy to get discouraged, of maybe even burned out, as trying to say, like, how do we go forward in solving some of these problems? So again, that's why we're here, telling our story, giving you hopefully debugging tools that we are learning. We are constantly on a journey ourselves, but these tools to help you become a better developer. Yeah,
because to be honest, we're telling you some success stories here, but there's a lot of still tickets in our backlog that have yet to be solved. Yeah. Now, the thing is, because of these success stories, I have confidence that we'll be able to solve them. So it's just a matter of when, not if, for me. But you may not feel that way. And hopefully, by providing success stories, even for difficult problems, you will kind of move into that mode of when and not if.
I love that.
If you aren't there already.
Yeah. wow, that could not have been stated better, seriously. But it's that confidence. And I think that's what it comes back to is the confidence to know that you can solve a problem. And the reality is, well, there's some problems that will seem unsolvable. And yet you can do it. And I'm going to put some caveats on there. Like, I remember talking to somebody a little while ago, and they were having issues, I think, with cron jobs, and jobs just weren't finishing. Well, it turns out it was an out of memory killer that was running. Of course, the server was maxing out of memory. Out of memory killer was running and was randomly selecting which process to kill. Well, occasionally that was the cron job. Like, things like that is really, 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 really difficult. But most of the issues, with enough time and being creative and following the approach that I've laid out in the Art of eCommerce debugging book, the TAD framework, you can do it. You can solve it. And so don't forget that. Jesse, why don't you open up with something you fought here recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a issue where customers would add a product to cart and it would be $0. This is on dev, so it's not actual customer. It's like a QA customer. So the good type of customer to find bugs.
So you caught it before it went to production.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So anyways, well, we were just about to go to production, so the urgency was up a little bit and trying to figure out, okay, let's get this fixed as soon as we can and identify the problem. And so $0 added to cart. There was a couple aspects that kind of obfuscated that. It made it a little bit more hidden. And so I jumped in there. I will say I kind of took advantage of the recent pull requests. That kind of gave me a little bit of a head start on where to look, because I was able to guess. I assumed that this problem was fairly recent because we hadn't seen it before. So I started by looking at those pull requests and see, hey, is there any clues as to where this problem might be coming up? And so with that, I found some changes being made to the system or the engine that handles some pricing around products, around quote items and things like that. And so kind of dig into that, and I'm seeing some changes to return types. So return types being like, is it going to return null or float or a string that is like a string that contains, 5.27 for a price of $5.25 or something like that, right? So there had been some changes to that, and on the surface they looked great. There was one that checked if the value from the database was null, so it used the PHP is null check to see if the value exactly equaled null, and if it did, it would return null, and if it didn't, it would cast the value to a float. And the idea in this case was, if the value is unset, we want to make sure to treat it as unset. But if it's a value 0 or greater, we need to treat it as a value. And this is one thing that I see as confusing, because 0 is considered falsy. So it will equate, if you do 0 is like false, that evaluates to true in PHP because it considers them roughly equivalent. And that's you could argue about whether that's a strength or a weakness for PHP, but either way, that's the way that it works. So you have to be careful with some of those things when 0 is an acceptable value, whereas you want to distinguish that from like null or false or something like that. Well, what happened was the value was coming in as false in the specific situation that I was looking at because that row had not been added to the database yet. So typically the value will be null because there was a value in another table that was being factored into this quote item kind of price decision. That other table would return null typically. But in this one case, that row hadn't been created yet. And this is in the call stack. Just down the call stack, it would have been created. So it's just a matter of a small difference in terms of like time in the request, where it was false at that particular moment. So all it took was adjusting the return handling and allowing and saying, hey, if it's like false or null, then let's do null. And otherwise, let's handle it in terms of a float. But I think as far as takeaways from that, for me, I was thinking about being careful with types. And I kind of already talked a little bit about that, but remembering that 0 might be a valid number, might be a valid value, I should say. An empty string could be a valid value. And distinguishing between that and null can be important depending on your circumstances. And thinking about those things as you build the application, as you write the code, can be very helpful to avoid bugs down the road. And just thinking like, what would valid values look like that might be returned from this particular function or whatever you're working with? And the other thing that I thought about in this is that it's good to have a willingness to do significant refactoring, right? This was a change fairly deep in the system of adding products to cart and stuff. Excuse me. And so being willing to make those changes is good. However, when you do that, it's also good to flag it up in particular to QA and to do a little bit extra checking yourself just to make sure that everything is working well and such. So those are the two things that I came away with. Ultimately, it was one of those things that if it wasn't for the PR, could have actually taken a while to track down where the problem was. But that little aspect kind of gave me a head start on that because I looked there first.
Well, that's really good. And I think that's a debugging tool right there, is to look at what changed, right? So if this worked yesterday or 2 days ago and it doesn't work today, we now have a timestamp, a delineation, demarcation for where to start looking. And we have to always remember there are three things that will influence behavior. There's code, there's the database, and the environment. Environment rarely changes. The database is definite a changer, and so is the code. So you can look at what changed in the database, what changed in the code in those past couple of days. Backups are ridiculously helpful in some of those cases as well. Obviously, not necessarily in your case here, but looking at those code, at the code can make a big difference.
Well, and this comes down to speed too, right? Because sometimes we talk about the ability, like we just talked about, the ability to solve a problem kind of no matter what, when, not if, right? But at a certain level, it can take so long for a person of a specific skill set to solve a problem that it can be impractical for management or whatever to facilitate that, right? So what we want to do is identify what areas are most likely to cause the problem, and that expedites our solving of the problem. So in this case, the code change was the most likely in my book. So starting off with code changes that maybe we had recently made was the most likely cause for that. And so that's where I'm going to start with, like, where can I go first that will most likely get me to this finish line kind of as quickly as possible? And looking for and learning kind of that hierarchy where those things are. Now, our assumption may be wrong. And in that case, that TAD framework of going back, that rinse and repeat aspect of going back to start, evaluating where we're at, all of that helps with that. But as we gain experience and troubleshoot these things, thinking about that, which one is most likely to allow us to complete this change?
Along those lines, I wasn't planning on saying this story, but I'll jump in here with a similar story. But code, we were getting ready to go to take code to production, and we were getting a notice that styles were broken in production. Before headed to production in our final UAT. And so we're like, okay, so what's going on there? Started digging in. Well, we turned out there was an error on generating the style sheets in the deploy static content. And it was like, okay, so how do we fix this? And so we started digging in. Jesse, I think you were working on it too. And we were working on, I don't remember the exact error message, but it was something about this particular email font CSS file cannot be found. So what I ended up doing, to be really honest, I had, and this was error logs out of our CI system. So I recreated the environment locally, literally ran through step-by-step of our CI process to try to get a local replication of this so I could at least get in and debug it, get my debugger going on this particular line. And as I got in there, I started running, before I even got to that command, I started running into this weird error about cannot generate this class, and I cannot instantiate this class. And it gave me a class name. So I started looking into that, and I'm like, what's going on here? So this is where the Xdebugger is just mind-boggling powerful as far as giving you insight. So I set a breakpoint on the constructor of that, where that error message was thrown. And that gave me the call stack. And what I found was, and this is just such terrible practice, but it is what it is. So this is how it relates back to importing these orders. I had included this class to, it was from a module vendor. I won't say their name. I had included this class to be able to facilitate adding some extension attributes of this for this type of operation to the given sales order object. And it turns out that this class calls, ends up calling the database for a given value, a given row that was expected to be there, but it was not there. And so basically that happened for every single run, or anytime you run bin Magento. And so ultimately, we probably could have caught that if we were looking also in the logs. Some of the other logs kind of started alluding to that, but we were mostly focused on this because the site was running. We were focused in on the styles being broken. But that all came back to the fact that earlier that day, I had included that class in there. Everything seemed to be running fine, but that was because it was on a fully installed environment. If you ran it on a non-installed Magento or a non-initialized, like from the database perspective, environment, things blew up. And so I took a big lesson that I wanted to learn in that the PRs, looking at the PRs, just like what Jesse was talking about here, also do that with an open mind. Because ultimately, I knew that literally hours earlier in the day, it was working. And you had identified my commit as the one that broke it. I reviewed my commit. I'm like, how in the world could this have broken anything? This was just simply making some changes to this import process. There's no problems with that. But if I would look at this with an open mind, and then ultimately tried to replicate that sooner as a result of looking at that PR and focusing in on that specific area, I think I could have solved the problem a little bit faster, maybe an hour faster. I don't know. I got it solved by 7 o'clock that night, I think. So it was still a little bit of stress that I could have also alleviated off myself if I would have approached this with a more open mind.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. Those things can be so difficult to troubleshoot when they're so far away. But it also makes me think of the value of a team in this as well. And in this case, you didn't really have that advantage, but our team member who is incredible with CI/CD guessed that was the problem.
Really?
Yeah. So in talking with him, when I was talking with him, funny. And he didn't have time in that case to troubleshoot it himself and identify where it went wrong. But as we were talking about it, he's like, I think this is the problem. And
that's funny.
So, and I should have relayed that to you as well, since that's what you were working on. But the team can be just incredible as we work together and don't try to just like silo and do it ourselves.
Yeah.
But when we have that opportunity, and we don't always, but when we have that opportunity, it can make a big difference to just discuss it with other people.
Yes, and it is a common problem. We've run into it quite a number of times. The solution was literally to proxy that class out, so it's not immediately initialized. And I'll say this right now, it's a huge pet peeve. It causes a lot of problems. Never, ever run queries from your constructor. Ever do that, please. You'll save yourself time down the road. You're going to save other people time down the road. It's just bad practice. And I hate to say it, Magento does it. And I hate to say it, other module vendors do it too. It's just really bad practice.
Give yourself a vacation and just skip the database call in it. Because if you think about all the time that you're going to save.
Yeah, and it's not even that hard to do later. Like, I mean, in most cases, you just, if you need to make it always available, just create a method with that database call in it, and if you can cache out the value from that in a class variable. So the net result is basically the same, and you're going to save yourself a lot of effort as time goes on. So, Jesse, how about do you have another one?
Yeah, so this one's actually a little bit more leans on architecture side of it and solving problems as it relates to architecting something out for basically code structure that other people might work on. And I actually tweeted this out the other day. The concept being...
You tweeted out. Did I retweet it?
No, you didn't.
I've got to follow him on Twitter. What's your handle? Make sure.
Baseplayer_7. I don't tweet a whole lot, but
when he does, it's worth listening to.
But what I said was to the effect of, well, actually, I'll just read it. When developing a feature, I like to think about how the functionality might be expanded in the future. Then I choose naming and architecture that would allow for at least some of that expansion. This requires minimal effort and results in better code. And so by thinking down the road, I'm actually improving the code that I'm writing today just for the requirements of what I'm working on here. And I find it takes minimal effort. And what it allows me to do is to think about naming in a more flexible way, right? We don't want to move very far outside of our requirements, because then we get into situations where we're building way too much and we're kind of like, we're not even really building for anything in specific. We're just kind of like throwing architecture at the wall. What we want to do is take a reasonable step in that direction of making our code allow for future changes and be flexible in the future.
Yes.
And so an example of that, because that could be a lot of jargon for you, so if you lost me on that, don't worry about it. It's okay. But an example of that is I'm integrating React with Magento in a area in the admin panel, and React is so much faster than Knockout. Speaking of pet peeves, that's one of mine. Anyways, so
the speed or Knockout?
Well, the lack of speed with Knockout.
I get that.
Yeah, it's.
Once you get used to Knockout, it's not bad. It's still ridiculous. It's really slow, and that's that.
Yes, but on the other hand, too, Knockout also doesn't have very many good ways, or in my opinion, it doesn't have a good way to componentize things. You have to go through this like fairly obtuse stack in order to get those components broken out.
That's fair.
So those are kind of the two things that I have trouble with Knockout. But anyways, so integrating React with the admin panel, it's actually fairly easy to do. But one of the things that I wanted to do is provide configuration from Magento to this React app. And one of the things that I could have done is build a PHP class that includes that information, kind of like an associative array, and I just bunch it up, JSON code it, and out it goes, and I'm set. Then that's all it takes. But what I did instead was thinking about the future. What other information might I want to add here? So instead of just building that associative array out, what I did was I had a data provider class that still ships out an array, but what it does instead is it builds that array, and it builds it with other data providers that are specified in di.xml. So I specify as arguments to this class other classes that must implement a specific interface, and then I call that. Those generate that configuration, and it sends it out. I suspect that's a 15-minute difference ultimately, and at least in terms of development time for me. I
push it up to an hour. It won't make a difference.
Right. I suspect it took me that little time to build it in such a way where I can easily add information, I can group information, all of those things. And it also helped me think about naming in such a way. I'm going to name this configuration provider for, what it's doing in this provision of data for the React app instead of something more specific. And so just taking a step back and thinking about what will I want to do tomorrow with this application, and then seeing, okay, this is where I want it to be. What are a couple steps that I could take in that direction that might not take me very much time?
That's
and
well put, yeah.
As long as there's that time that's available, then just going ahead and doing that.
Yeah, and the other thing to add on to that is, let's say you've approached a class that is a massive associative array that's being returned out of there, and you're just scratching your head. It's like, okay, I got to add another field, and it's just killing you. It's like, do I really have to add another field to that? Well, in that case, take that same approach. Inject a array of, just allow an array of data providers to be injected in there into your constructor, and add to that end of that, to the end of that, and just that associative array, and run through those list of data providers and add to it. You've now created yourself a backward compatible way of being able to add to this array. And the nice thing is but the other thing to add on to your data provider approach with those little mini data provider classes, you could then create after plugins. And I know there's debate about whether plugins are good or bad, but you can create after plugins then that would modify that data in another reusable fashion. So, or semi-reusable, depending on how you build it. So there's a lot of advantages of thinking small, well, and like in this case, I think with your data provider, one public method is what we shoot for in almost every class. One public method, as many private methods as you want. And it cleans things up as well, makes things a lot easier to understand, i.e. debug.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also provides easier ways to, like you were talking about, extend or change that information if necessary in the future. So much of it comes back to encapsulation. How can we group our functionality together in such a way that it does one thing, and that's it. And we want to name that one thing well.
Yes.
And we can then work with that one thing. We're not trying to do 50 things with our class or method or variable.
Yeah, absolutely. That's well put. There was one other thing I was going to touch on. Actually, I'm just going to throw this in real quick. We're basically out of time. You mentioned adding to cart being $0. We had an issue where adding to cart was also $0. And it turned out by digging into this that there was an infinite loop. And infinite loops really are the bane of developers. You don't get any information out of this, and it's very difficult to solve the problem. Now, it's easy if you're using a profiler and the infinite loop is in one method. But when the infinite loop is spread out over 10 methods, that is really difficult to understand. And again,
it's been black hole.
Literally. And the way I solved that, just again, debugging toolbox here, I downloaded the database locally. I added I used Xdebug, and I added breakpoints to where just throughout the process, I could literally, I think that was the recalculating the quote totals, I think. So I added several breakpoints just randomly through that. I mean, well, randomly, as best places I thought they could possibly be, feeling like it was going to be somewhere in that area. And then I ran the code and I started refining my breakpoints to find out exactly, and watching the call stack to find out exactly where those problems were. I copied the call stack out into Sublime, and I started trying to find what was matching in that. In fact, that'd be kind of a cool tool I didn't find anything, maybe it's out there, but to be able to analyze patterns in a call stack, because again, I knew it was very tall. I knew it was it was definitely a problem, but at the end of the day, it was a matter of just trying to get in there using my eyes to analyze the patterns that were there. So that was another one of those, and wish we could dive into that a little deeper. But
Xdebug to the rescue. Do you happen to recall that error message that you saw that made you think of infinite loops?
I think one of our other developers was in there, and I think maybe he tipped me off that it was an infinite loop.
Okay.
But I don't recall. So locally, if Xdebug is configured like this, it can stop after 256, I think is the default.
Yeah, and it'll show out of memory. Yep.
Yeah, which is out of memory issues are another whole ball game. But I think he had taken it to the point of saying that it was an infinite loop, which that can be difficult to even get it to that point, because ultimately was it that it was timing out? I think that was a result of a timeout that we were getting, which is, like, again, some of the worst, because you don't really get any feedback out of that. And I might actually, as I think about, might have been confusing two issues there. I don't think so. So anyways, all that to say, that was a tricky, difficult problem to work out of. So anything else to add before we wind this show up?
That's all I got.
Excellent. Well, thank you for listening to yet another podcast of Smash the Bug. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, we're there. So wherever you're wanting to listen to and learn more about development, especially in an e-commerce environment, you'll find us there. So all that to say, thank you for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure spending this 35 minutes roughly with you, and I hope you have an absolute fantastic rest of your day.